The once mighty Imperial China had faced enormous hardships by the 1860s. The Taiping Rebellion, 2 opium wars, multiple concurrent rebellions, and several devastating natural disasters. The country was backward in terms of military compared to Western powers. Fortunately, several important commanders were aware that China was in need of modernization, marking the beginning of the self-strengthening movement under Prince Gong. The mother of the young Tongzhi Emperor, Empress Dowager Cixi, was an arch-conservative, however, and would slowly but surely go further and further in her attempts to obstruct reforms, even as far as murder. After the French and British occupied Beijing in 1860, the Qing dynasty stood with its back against the wall. In several areas in China, the realization that reform was necessary became apparent. The Manchu Prince Gong, brother of the Qianfeng Emperor, signed the peace treaty with Western powers, ending the Second Opium War. A year later, in 1861, the Qianfeng Emperor passed away. He was succeeded by his 5-year-old son, Tongzhi, whose mother, the Empress Dowager Cixi, accepted regency after launching a coup together with Prince Gong and Empress Dowager Xian. Cixi would be the main figure in Chinese politics until her death in 1908, shortly before the fall of the Qing dynasty. For now, Cixi, a staunch conservative, was obliged to accept certain reforms Prince Gong advocated. After all, he helped her ascend to the regency and the throne, albeit indirectly. Under young Emperor Tongzhi, there was an attempt at dynastic restoration. In combination with Qing victory over the Taiping, Nian, and Muslim rebellions, the Qing managed to restore a certain degree of the bureaucracy, prosperity, and restrain rural unrest, the primary reasons for those rebellions. Magistrates and gentry and sure depopulated areas were habituated again, thanks to the governmental decrees ensuring tax reductions for those that moved there. Irrigation networks vital to Chinese agrarian life were restored and waterworks were erected. Taxes on agrarian products were reduced, if not abolished altogether. The government certainly made an attempt to restore the facilities that had been lost during the rebellions and wars. Most importantly, the Zhongli Yamen was established, something that resembled a Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Why did China not have an institution such as this one before? Well, because it considered itself the center of the world. It didn't need to enter into relations with other countries. Other countries simply had to subject themselves and pay tribute to China. The Qing dynasty lost bits of influence in provinces thanks to the gentry and magistrates, standing at the forefront of the restoration. Furthermore, the armies that were created to crush rebellions, such as the Yunnan and Anhui army, would continue to exist, with its leaders, most notably Zhang Guofan and Li Hongchang, becoming very powerful individuals. Men that had acquired influential positions sought to find the root of the reasons China had suffered defeats those past years. Not surprisingly, many looked at the military superiority of the West, or barbarians, as many Chinese referred to Europeans. Zhang Guofan, Li Hongzhang, and Zhou Zuntang attempted to get the country on par with the West when it came to military prowess, the so-called self-strengthening movement, and it wasn't aspiring to pursue far-reaching reforms in Chinese society. On the contrary, it wanted to modernize its military in order to protect its society and culture against Western influence, using the barbarians to control the barbarians. Now, during the Taiping Rebellion, military leaders such as the aforementioned men had already started to arm troops with Western weaponry. These developments were now taken further, not just arming forces on land, but modeling a naval fleet after the Western model and constructing modern arsenals and armament factories. Indeed, by the mid-1870s, China was manufacturing thousands of small arms in terms of quality. These were comparable to the arms Europeans were using. All these modernization efforts were made on the basis of the input of Western advisors. Most commanders wanted to get rid of these expensive and often incompetent Western advisors. A project to establish schools educating Chinese in Western languages and science was launched. International law was taught as well. in order for the next generation of diplomats to be capable of beating Western powers at their own game. Zheng Guofan once said, "We should carefully watch and learn their superior techniques and also observe their shortcomings. If they abandon good relations and break their covenant, we would then have the weapons to oppose them." He of course referred to the Western powers. Ingenious ways to handle foreign relations and collect custom dues, build modern ships and weaponry, and to start teaching international law were explored. The rudiments of modern science were established. Self-strengthening took off in a hopeful direction. Perhaps the future of China was more secure than it had been, though rural areas still marked by tax evasion and corrupt holders of power. The Qing was regaining some of its former strength. It would certainly benefit the dynasty if it could ensure forceful imperial leadership and a resolute Grand Council. Young scholars were even sent to the United States and Europe to study the state systems, industrial technology, military tactics, and progress in science. During these years, the American Civil War was waging on, just to give a small idea of the time frame we're talking about. These types of reforms had unintended consequences, however. Those students that did return began advocating radical forms of educational reforms. China, of course, had the traditional state exam system to educate bureaucrats in service of the Qing dynasty. Now, these students were advocating for reform in all kinds of subjects, from chemistry and mathematics to foreign languages. Conservative Confucian scholars were afraid for the loss of traditional values in Chinese society. The most important opponent of these reforms was the Empress Dowager Cixi, regent of the emperor, and she would attempt to undermine Prince Gong at every turn. Unfortunately for the Qing, any real forceful leadership remained absent. Tongzhi passed away in 1875 at the age of 19. The boy had recently become of age and thus did not need a regent anymore. Though the official cause of death was noted as smallpox, historians believe his mother, Cixi, played a role. Supporting this hypothesis is the suicide of the pregnant empress shortly after, with many historians believing she was driven to suicide by Cixi. Murdering those that opposed Cixi's will would remain a pattern throughout her career, and Tongzhi wouldn't be the last emperor she would allegedly kill. Cixi could only stay in power if she continued her role as regent, and as such, the 3-year-old nephew of the Tongzhi emperor, Guangxu, was appointed with Cixi as his regent. Against Chinese tradition, Guangxu was of the same generation as Tongzhi instead of a generation after. Doesn't seem that important, though nevertheless, Cixi silenced opposition, though one upright Confucian official committed suicide outside Tongzhi's tomb to protest Cixi's decision. When it came to policy, especially foreign policy and reform, Cixi clashed badly with Prince Gong. At one point, Gong ordered the execution of one of Cixi's eunuchs. Cixi was personally offended. It is interesting to note that one of the reasons for the collapse of the Ming dynasty before the Qing was the domination of court by eunuchs. Gong may have been trying to prevent this. Nevertheless, he would not hold any position of power for a long time. As for the powerful provincial statesman, Zheng Guofan passed away in 1872, Wang Xiang in 1876, and Ze Congtang remained preoccupied with the Muslim rebellions on China's periphery. The men residing in Beijing generally were conservative, not very eager to reform China. Now, self-strengthening programs were initiated in China still, but a disproportionate amount of these programs were initiated by one man, Li Hongchang. Both Governor-General and Commissioner of Trading Ports, Cixi, trusted him. He was, besides Cixi, perhaps the most important figure in China during the last decades of the 19th century. He sought to diversify China's enterprise into areas that would have long-range effects on the country's overall development. The feudal and traditional Chinese society was modernizing in some aspects, albeit slowly. The biggest weakness of the self-strengthening movement was in the modesty of its goals. No matter whether it was during the early stages of military modernization or later on, when schools with a Western curriculum were established, these modernization elements were always on the fringe. At most, they were curious old beings in a very traditional society. China's traditional exam system was a big hurdle for self-strengthening. Confucian scholars had access to the bureaucracy, basically the only way to climb up the social hierarchy for many Chinese. The movement wasn't properly guided by the Qing court. By Qing court I mean Cixi, as she practically reigned by herself after Prince Gong was sidelined. Nevertheless, she was faced with the increased independence of provincial governors. The tangible execution of the self-strengthening movement, more often than not, was very dependent on the amount of conflict between subordinate, often rival, authorities. Every attempt at modernization that was successfully implemented was constantly endangered by the corruption of the bureaucracy. Cixi was no less guilty of this either. One of the most notorious cases was the Northern Baiyang fleet. Funny story. The goal was set during the 1880s to modernize the outdated fleet, allocating an enormous amount of funds to it. When the Sino-Japanese War broke out in 1894, it turned out this fleet was neglected. It was completely destroyed, and it was barely a match for the Japanese fleet. When tracing the funds that were allocated to the fleet, it turned out Empress Dowager Cixi and her courtiers had spent most of the money on the rebuilding of the Summer Palace in the Forbidden City, destroyed by European powers during the Second Opium War over 3 decades earlier. There were more of these instances of type of corruption, in essence crippling China's modernization. Lastly, but certainly not least, was the aversion towards self-strengthening. China's society was still very much conservative, even when it came to the military. This can be seen decades later, even during the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxer sect refused to fight with guns, much preferring sticks and swords, considered more traditional. As you can see, there was a rift between conservatives and modest reformers. These would clash many times until the downfall of the Qing 50 years later. In this video, I've attempted to briefly summarize the trends that were going on in China after it faced one of its deadliest episodes. As we can see, Empress Dowager Cixi cemented her power in a ruthless manner, and we've seen that Li Hongzhang was the primary figure instigating reforms, though modest in several areas once Prince Gong was gotten rid of. Next video will be all about the Sino-Japanese War, which will make horribly clear that China's modernization program was insufficient, to put it mildly. If you're wondering what transpired during the last decades of China's once mighty Qing dynasty, consider checking out the playlist on the screen right now, covering the history of both China and the Qing dynasty from the Taiping Rebellion all the way to the Qing's eventual downfall in the 20th century. It covers all wars, rebellions, and political developments in between. Thank you for watching this video, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.